I even had a boyfriend. Well, it's not really a boyfriend. I liked him. He didn't like me, but that's another story. And the kids, of course, laughed. And then she said, I remember being dragged from my home in Hungary, in Debrecen, and our neighbors laughing. We arrived here in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I'll never forgive myself what happened next. I never had a chance to say goodbye to my mother. And I'm an old woman now, but I'll never make peace with that fact that I never had a chance to say goodbye to my mother. And then I moved to Canada. I began my life again. I married, I had children, but the memories will always be with me. And then she looked at the students and said, please work for a world where nobody will have memories like mine ever again. Please work for Tikkun Olam. Please be my witnesses. And hearing her tell the story in the very place that tragedy unfolded means that for the rest of our lives and the students' lives, they will remember, I was in Auschwitz with a survivor. I remember she told us a story the last time she saw her mother. That will never leave me. And they will transmit that stories to others in a way that you can't do from reading a book or simply watching a film. So I think there's an incredible power of hearing the stories in the very places the tragedies unfolded. And that's just one example of that.
What have you heard from those students who have heard those stories firsthand, as you say, in those places of horror?
Well, the students embrace the survivors. They support the survivors. And they've committed to transmitting the memory of the survivors to the next generation. And they do it in a very universal way. They say it's not just about fighting anti-Semitism and hatred towards Jews, it's about fighting against all forms of racism and injustice and intolerance. And I should say on the trip itself, the students give incredible support to the survivors. I remember David Shento, a Holocaust survivor from Ottawa. When he arrived in Auschwitz as a teenager, he was standing in the selection, and the prisoners were told to give up their belongings. And one man said, please, let me hold on to my family photograph. At that moment, the Nazis sicked his dog on him, and he was killed on the spot. When David returned with the students to Auschwitz-Birkenau and was standing at the gates, all of a sudden he froze. He became paralyzed. And two students went on each side and said, David, we will walk in together with you and we'll walk out together. And so the survivors tell the stories to the students, and the students give hope to the survivors because they're remembering their stories and learning the lessons and building a better world for all humanity. And I've seen that throughout my experience, that the students go off in the world, do incredible work in human rights activism and social justice because of what they see on the March of the Living. And they are empowered by the survivors to be the witnesses for the witnesses.
In the work that you've done, you've met a number of people, and you've mentioned some of them. Tell me about your interactions with General Romeo Dallaire.
Well, as I said, the universal lessons of the Holocaust are as important as the specific lessons. In other words, the specific lessons to fight anti-Semitism, universal lessons to fight any kind of intolerance and racism. And I remember meeting Romeo Dallaire once at a dinner, and I'm going to get the story as close as I can get to it because it's many years ago, but it was a story that left a deep impact on me. And we all know Romeo Dallaire, one of the few people who tried to stop the genocide in Rwanda, which happened at a quicker rate than the Holocaust, if you can believe that. And one of the few people tried to stop it. When he came back to Canada, he was so sad that he didn't do more, yet he was one of the few people that did anything. And a true Canadian hero. And in his story, he talks about being in a village that had completely wiped out by the Hutus, and there was almost nobody left, but he came across one Tutsi child that was battered, bruised, and crying. And he picked up the child to try to comfort him. And that moment, he asked himself, what am I doing here? Thousands of miles away from home, a different country, different culture, different everything. What am I doing here? Then he looked into the child's eyes, and he knew the answer, because when he looked into the child's eyes, he saw the eyes of his own children back in Canada, wanting love, wanting protection, wanting dignity, wanting respect, wanting nurturing. And that's when he realized there is no difference. That's when he realized that no human is more human than any other human. And why do genocides and holocausts happen? Because we simply haven't figured out that very, very, very obvious fact that no human is more human than any other human. And I often say to the students, there's so many lessons you learn in the March of Living from the history of this incredibly challenging moment in human experience. But if the only lesson you get out of this is that no human is more human than any other human, the ultimate infinite dignity of all humanity, that would be enough for me. So I always remember Romeo Dallaire's message, and I always teach it to the students on the trip, and they accept the lesson.
Those students are incredibly lucky to be on a trip like that and to have that opportunity to learn. But we'll often hear stories of students, younger students, who have no knowledge of the Holocaust at all. That they will be asked if they know details, and they say that they've never heard of it before. When you hear that, I mean, these are regular stories, but when you hear that, based on the work that you do, what goes through your mind?
It's sad to me because it reminds us of how much work we have to do. But at the same time, I do not want to give into cynicism and despair. And that means we have to redouble our efforts. I will tell you a little story that kind of answers this question. Many years ago, I went back to my hometown from my grandfather's side, called Tarlów in Poland. I went there for rededication of the cemetery. What happened was a Polish doctor moved into the town, and he found out that not only did Nazi Germany murder all the Jews in the town and desecrate the cemetery, but the cemetery had fallen to such decay that it virtually disappeared from the map. And this Polish doctor felt that it was his duty and his responsibility to try to restore that cemetery. So he went from door to door knocking on people's doors to see if he can find pieces and slabs and fragments of the cemetery that once existed in the small, tiny little town in central Poland. And finally, after 10 years of working hard, they managed to rebuild part of the cemetery, to build a gate around the cemetery and put some of the slabs in a kind of an artistic formation. When I was there, I asked him, I said, Dr. Curlio, Dr. Jan Curley, what prompted you to do this? And he said, because I felt such a terrible, terrible sadness with the fate of the Jewish people. And I'm a doctor, but I don't want to heal people. I want to heal wounds in society. I decided I'm going to make this my life's mission. And just then, a young girl came over and said, I found another slab of a Jewish tombstone in a barn. Can I bring it over the next day? And I looked at him and I said, Dr. Curlio, isn't this amazing what you've done? You restored a Jewish cemetery. You brought all these people together for rededication. How do you feel? Do you feel pride? What do you feel? And he said, I feel I have to gather even more stones. I feel I have to gather even more stones. So when you ask me that question, there's still a lot of work that has to be done, but we cannot shirk from the task.
Well, and we see the need for that work right now in terms of, as you and I are talking, there has been a huge increase in anti-Semitism here and around the world. And I just wonder what, in 2023, we're starting a new year, what that tells you about who we are and the state of who we are.
It tells us that in every generation, we're going to have to fight the fight anew, that in every generation, there's going to be forces of evil that rise up and try to get history to repeat itself. And I'm reminded of a story of a Holocaust survivor who was with her mother. She was a teenage girl, and she was digging a trench with her mother. Her mother became quite ill and started to kind of become a little bit, relaxed on the job. And all of a sudden, this 15-year-old boy who was a member of the Hitler Youth, because towards the end of the war, the Nazis started running out of men, so they were taking teenagers to enforce their terrible cruelty. And he started beating, this 15-year-old started beating her mother. And she came out of the trench and said, how could you do that? How could you beat my mother? That's my mother. Don't you have a mother yourself? And the German Hitler Youth member said, I have a mother, but she's German. And then he stormed away. But the next day he came back. They said, here's a carrot to help you with your nutrition, and here's a cigarette. We'll take your mind off your hunger. And she realized, even to that Hitler Youth, her words about having a mother had an impact. So, you know what? There's a lot of anti-Semitism, there's a lot of hatred, but drop by drop by drop, we will make an impact, even on people like that story, the Holocaust survivor shared.
It's a very generous view of where we're at right now, because, and it's not cynicism, but you could see, and it would be understandable where people would feel despondent by what's going on, and feel as though, as you said, the work in front of you is doubled or tripled because of the state of humanity and where we're at right now.
Yes, it's a very challenging question. I'm reminded what Elie Wiesel said, the Nobel laureate, Holocaust survivor, writer of a number of incredibly very beautiful books and poignant and sad books. The Night is among them. He said, and this is not just to Jewish people, it applies to everybody, but he said in the context of being Jewish, he said, to be a Jew after the Holocaust, have every reason to give up your faith in God, give up your tradition, and give up your belief in humanity, and still not to do so. In other words, even though we have all the reasons to give up hope, we must not. We must keep on believing that there is seed of redemption in humanity that we can tap into any time.
What does that tell you then, just finally, about the importance of the work that you're doing, the importance of the work that has been honored by the Order of Canada?
Well, I feel so privileged to be having the ability to be make sure that the voices of the survivors are not forgotten. I remember once I was giving a speech in Montreal, and after this program came over, this Holocaust survivor came over and she said, please, she held my hand and looked into my eyes, please make sure our stories are never forgotten. And I think of all the goals of all Holocaust education, the ability to tell the stories, to make sure these survivors know their stories about families, loved ones will never be forgotten, and that the lessons have been learned has been a great privilege. And if I may, can I read you a short poem a student shared with me on the trip? Because I learned from the survivors, but I also learned from the students. And this is a poem written by a 17-year-old girl from Vancouver after she came back from the March of the Living in 1994. She wrote, "Still I cannot hate. I see bones and hair, shoes and glasses, while in a Nazi hell ruled by the devil's brother, but still I cannot hate. I see women's brushes and men's prayer shawls and babies' tighter clothing, but still I cannot hate. I see splintered boards where people lay their weary bodies to rest. I see where people slaved and tried to exist, and still I cannot hate. I see the death and destruction, but still I cannot hate. I won't continue this tragedy. I won't spread the disease. I won't fan the flames that hate like this inspires. Still I cannot hate," is the poem. And I think what she's teaching us is that the answer to hate is not more hate. The answer to hate is more love. And the answer to darkness is more light.
Ellie Rubenstein, congratulations on the work that you have done. It's important, but also on the recognition for that work. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you for this privilege.
Ellie Rubenstein is a religious leader of Congregation Habanim and the longtime national director of the March of the Living, just named to the Order of Canada. He was in Toronto. If you missed any of our conversations with other recipients of the Order of Canada, go to cbc.ca/thecurrent. Thus far, we've heard from doctors and activists and entertainers and educators about their contributions to the fabric of Canadian life in interviews like this one.
I think it's a bedrock of strong democracies. It's an investment, and I see public education, a strong public education, as very important to a strong community, a strong society.
Armand Doucette is a multi-award-winning educator in New Brunswick. His thoughts on the power of public education resonated with many of you.
If you look at schools today, they're very much the hub of communities. Though we are teaching the curriculum and curriculum outcomes, there's also the social emotional development, executive functioning skills, competencies like critical thinking, problem solving, and so on. It's about building relationships with my students and figuring out what makes them tick for them to be able to flourish in the classroom.
We received, as you can imagine, a lot of mail with your thoughts on this topic and the teachers in your life that changed your life. The Current's senior producer, Karen Marley, is here to read some of your mail. Karen, good morning.
Good morning, Matt. So we can start with a letter from Phyllis Ellis. She says, "I attended school during World War II. I'm 93 now. Many of our activities were designed to help the war effort. When I was in grade 5, I had a wonderful teacher named Mrs. Whitehead. Every day at 3 o'clock, we were told to put down our books and take out our knitting. Yes, knitting. Mrs. Whitehead would sit atop a student desk and read to us as we knitted our 6-inch squares. They would be joined together into a blanket by Red Cross volunteers and sent to the bombed-out people in Britain. She read books such as Heidi and Treasure Island. What a wonderful gift to us. A teacher who taught us to love the classics. It also taught us how every little bit helps when you are working towards a common goal. Everyone during those war years did something to help us toward victory, no matter what age you were."
This one is from Karen Campbell in Calgary. Karen writes, "In 1979, my family moved to Edmonton just as I was entering grade 10. I had a bumpy ride that first year. I was overwhelmed with the challenges of school life, and it impacted my attendance and the completion of coursework. As my graduating class was wrapping up their final year, I was facing the prospect of returning in the fall for a third semester of grade 12. Thankfully, during this period, I discovered the drama room and participated in a few extracurricular projects under the direction of legendary drama teacher Mr. Agrell Smith. As my third semester of grade 12 drew to a close, I happened to be in the drama room after school. Agrell, as we called him, casually inquired about my plans once I finished high school. school. His question seemed sincere, and my answer came easily. I'm going to get a job. I elaborated that my transcript was a bit of a mess, with missed classes and a few F grades. Agrell nodded, and then he said, "You know, Karen, if you do decide to pursue a post-secondary program of any kind, just know the day you begin is the day that no one will ever be interested in your high school transcript again. If you don't, then I guess you're right. It will stand as your record." His low-key observation was a game changer for me. In that moment, he broadened my view and shifted my thinking. A year or two later, I was admitted to the University of Alberta Education faculty, and last year I retired from a 30-year career with the Calgary Board of Education. Agrell's lesson became a touchstone for me as a teacher and subsequently school administrator. Today is what is. Tomorrow is full of possibilities.
It's a nice message.
Yes.
We heard from another listener who described being so deeply impacted by a particular teacher that she too went on to become an educator. So this is Carol Alenko in Huntsville, Ontario, talking about what led her to become a geography teacher.
This goes way back, okay? So I was 14 and I'm now 71. So Mr. Stereo was my grade 8 geography teacher. He seemed to explain things very simply and thoroughly, and everything around me was suddenly explained. And looking at a map of the world and seeing how the continents could fit together was really enlightening. So I tried to do the same thing myself. And when I became a teacher, I went every day to school with a smile on my face. I was so glad to go, and I couldn't believe they were paying me for this fabulous job. To learn later that a couple of my kids, one had actually become a geography teacher and taught my son. And then another one just recently, this past summer, contacted me from way back and said that I was her favorite teacher. And she had become an educational assistant. And honestly, that made my year. I was just thrilled to hear that. I guess I'd say thanks for all of the interesting facts I learned about the world. And so nice that I was able to knowingly pass it on to at least a couple of people and their love of learning.
It's lovely. Maureen Capper from Montreal writes, listening to your program, I had to mention a teacher who really saved me. It's 1967. I was in grade 7 at Rosedale Elementary School in Montreal. New teacher walked into the classroom, Rodney Elkin. Coming from a non-supportive family and suffering from undiagnosed learning disabilities, I was struggling with school and untrusting of authority figures. Mr. Elkin was strict, but brought in literature, poetry, and music, including the Railroad Trilogy by Gordon Lightfoot, all of which we discussed and analyzed. He brought in mathematical puzzles and science experiments. And after a couple of weeks, he pointed in my direction and said, "You are smart. I'm going to put you in an accelerated math course, and I want you to tutor a fellow student." I looked behind me as I couldn't imagine that he could be speaking to me. I hadn't a shred of confidence left. He said, "Yes, you, Maureen. I'm talking to you." And I did grade 7, 8, and 9 math at my own speed and tutored my friend. I slowly built confidence, all the while with a learning disability that I later learned is dyscalculia. I wish I could find him to tell him how grateful I am.
Maybe he'll get in touch.
Maybe.
Finally, this note from Lee Carter in Gibsons, British Columbia. I thank you for this subject matter, as I feel that we are losing good teachers at an alarming rate. I have a family member who is in her second year of teaching in BC at a school with too many students in her class. Some students have behavioral and educational challenges, and aides are almost non-existent, so teachers are left to deal with it on their own. I believe we have an education crisis, and our governments aren't willing to address the numerous problems that exist. So please continue to explore this issue with teachers, aides, principals, and parents.
Who's the teacher that you remember?
My high school chemistry teacher, Mr. Sumner, who taught us everything in stories.
And here you are, telling stories on the
Exactly.
radio. Karen Marley, senior producer on The Current, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thanks for all your mail. If there's anything you hear in the program that you want to comment on, get in touch. Email us, thecurrent@cbc.ca. Coming up after your regional update.
It shocks, of course, because we never expected people to disregard institutions like that. But at the same time, it's like watching a rerun of a movie that we already know.
Brazilians are reeling from an attack on their capital, from government buildings to their Supreme Court. What's happening on the ground there, and why some are comparing it to the storming of the U.S. Capitol 2 years ago. That story in 90 seconds. My name's Matt Galloway, and this is The Current.
9:30. I'm Sarah Trainer with a look at CBC New Brunswick news highlights. A judge has approved an order to place the company that owns the Caribou mine in receivership later this month. The move means the remaining Trevally mining workers will be terminated. People who don't want a jail to be built in Fredericton packed City Hall last night. City Council is dealing with a Government of New Brunswick application to rezone land for a jail in the Vanier Industrial Park. Last night, the motion to rezone the land passed first and second reading. The vote came after councillors heard expressions of opposition and support from the public. And St. John Council wants the province to give the city more power to deal with derelict buildings. The city is currently dealing with about 145 vacant buildings. Communities in other provinces use vacancy taxes or vacancy permits to discourage owners from leaving their buildings empty, but the province would have to grant that ability to municipalities. Your next CBC News is at 10. In the weather, mainly cloudy with flurries, but periods of light snow in the morning in the east. Highs between -6 and -1.
Hello again, I'm Matt Galloway. You're listening to The Current. After months of camping out in the capital, supporters of Jair Bolsonaro made their move in Brasilia on Sunday. That's the sound of thousands of supporters storming Brazil's Congress, Supreme Court, and presidential palace. They bashed their way through windows, climbed over monuments, paraded through mostly empty halls. The action comes just a week after the newly elected president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, was sworn into office. He is calling the demonstrators fascist fanatics and promising justice. Mac Margolis is a Washington Post columnist based in Brazil. He's in Rio de Janeiro. Mac, hello.
Good morning. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for being here. What is the situation like in Brazil this morning?
Well, in Brasilia, the capital, the situation finally seems to be under control. This after hundreds, over 1,000 people were bussed off to police precincts to be processed and charged and possibly formally imprisoned for taking part in the riot. But the cleanup crews are still cleaning up a mess which is considerable, and the damage which they left to the 3 headquarters of branches of power in Brazil.
How have people been reacting in the country to what happened on Sunday?
Well, outside the particular bubble of protesters in Brasilia, the reaction has been overwhelming negative against these what they call protests, but in fact are really riots, and what the media is calling quite openly a attempted coup. A reading taken of social media on the day of insurrection registered about 90% disapproval with the mobs who were overrunning Brasilia, and another interesting survey published just this morning shows that even though the mobs were connected to former President Bolsonaro, who is not in Brazil, even despite his absence, his own approval rating has plunged to levels unseen. So that seems to be a fairly faithful reading of what's happening.
As you understand it, I mean, one of the questions is how these protesters made their way into the buildings in the first place. Where were the security guards? Where were police at the time?
Well, exactly. That's the question, and that's the subject of much investigation and anger and accusations. So what we're seeing, this is coming out in drips and drabs, is that there was a security failing on many levels. Some people might say this was a failure of intelligence, military intelligence. However, that is unlikely, since these were some of the most telegraphed protests in a long time. People streaming in to the Capitol by the busloads for weeks. So this was anything but a surprise. And that raised the question of, well, why weren't the police and the security forces that protect the president and the branches of government crews are more active. There were skeleton crews at the presidential palace. The police were seen to be actually escorting the protesters from their encampments to the main square where three governing branches of power are located. So there's a lot of anger and reprimand about exactly what the police were doing.
As you mentioned, I mean, in some ways this was hardly a surprise because people had been camped out in front of the headquarters of the Brazilian army for something like 10 weeks before this riot took place. What are people, those who were involved in this, what are they saying about why they stormed the Supreme Court and the Congress?
Well, the narrative running through these protests is really quite simple. They're not demanding better conditions for Brazil. They're not asking for more liberty. They're basically alleging that the election, which took place 2 rounds in October, was rigged, that the Brazilian electoral system is fatally flawed, that the electronic voting machines were somehow hackable, vulnerable. All these things were alleged over and over with encouragement from Bolsonaro himself over the past year or two. In fact, the Brazilian electoral system is patently safe. The computer systems were open for public examination for months before the government even demanded that the armed forces take place in the audit of these machines. They did so and found nothing. So these are the claims, and as baseless as they are, they have persisted throughout the many weeks.
And that's why, I mean, we saw protesters standing on the roof of the Supreme Court and the Congress demanding the source code. This is for the voting machines that they somehow believe were hacked.
That's right. Notwithstanding that the source code was open for experts to examine, both within and outside of the government, again, for months. I think up to 10 months before the election. This is a routine occurrence in Brazil where electronic voting has been around for 20 years or so without incident. So this is basically, you might well imagine, the playbook from the U.S. where Donald Trump contested the election with Biden, which he lost, and perhaps even with slightly more legitimate grounds, not legitimate grounds, but more of an argument because of the very sometimes complicated and convoluted U.S. voting system, which is differs from state to state. Here in Brazil, it's nationwide. People vote on electronic machines. The vote is out in hours. And there really has never been until now anyone testing the results. As Lula said yesterday, no one has lost more presidential elections than he has. He's also won more than us, but every time he lost, he basically learned to go back home with his roots.
Do you see a straight through line between the United States, the most recent, as you mentioned, U.S. presidential election, but also the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, 2 years ago, and what we saw this weekend in Brazil?
There is, the Brazilians really took as their muse the people who raided the Capitol in the U.S., perhaps with even less of an agenda or actual strategy. But what is perhaps different, although I understand this is the object of a lot of investigation in the U.S. still, but what's clear in Brazil is how these encampments were supported from the very beginning by